Welcome to our daily reflection for this Friday, August 16th. And of course, every Friday we remember Good Friday, in which our bridegroom, Jesus Christ, laid down his life for us, the bride, the church, and that act of love saved us. And so we want to make a sacrifice out of love for others and offer that sacrifice up, whether it's giving up meat or some other meal or some other sacrifice today. And today we have rather heavy readings. And we have a very heavy, deep reading from the prophet Ezekiel in Ezekiel 16. This was kind of a rather explicit passage. It was a passage that young Hebrew boys weren't supposed to read. And so it was kind of censored out of modesty. But it talks about Israel as a bride and her infidelity, her nakedness and shame, her playing the harlot. And yet it talks about God's covenant and how God is faithful and how he will pardon and take Israel back in spite of her infidelities. And so the relationship between Israel and Yahweh is a covenant relationship. In other words, it's a marriage metaphor that defines Yahweh as the bridegroom, Israel as the bride, but the bride's unfaithful. And she plays the harlot. Now that's an interesting backdrop for what Jesus is going to talk about in the gospel, because the Pharisees come to test Jesus and they ask him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? In other words, they're looking at kind of what Hillel and the more liberal rabbinic tradition was, that you could divorce for any cause. And then the conservative cause was only for adultery. And Jesus doesn't go with either the liberal or the conservative rabbinic tradition. He says, in the beginning, it was not so. But what God joined together, let no man put asunder. And that the two become one flesh. And this union, this bond, is more than physical, it's covenantal, it's spiritual. And this is what is meant by covenant, because covenants are irrevocable. A contract can be temporary, and it can be revoked if someone doesn't hold up their end of the contract. But a covenant is far more binding. It's a family bond, and you're bound forever to the person you're bound to. Now, as the disciples will hear Jesus talk about this, well, they're like, well, it's not expedient to get married then. If marriage is an unbreakable covenant, you're bound to this person forever, no matter what their behavior is. Wow, that's a high risk. That's kind of heavy burden. And Jesus says, not everyone's going to accept this, but this is God's teaching. And that's important. And then he's going to say, look, divorce is due to the hardness of your hearts. In other words, the breakup of marriage is because of a failure of the heart. It's a failure of love. Now, God gives us the model. And I know that, when we think about this idea that, you can't have divorce in Jesus' teaching, it sounds so stern. It sounds so inflexible and such a weight and a burden. And yet, my friends, this is the good news. Without this burden, there's no salvation for us. Because go back to Ezekiel, the people of God, Israel, which represents all sinners, you and me, we will always sin. We will always be unfaithful to our covenant with God. And yet God doesn't divorce us. He will take us back and pardon us and forgive us. And if we play the unfaithful church, if the church plays the harlot like Israel did, God will reconcile us if we return and repent. And if we sinners stray, we know that God, in the covenant he has with us, will take us back. And so the covenant logic of salvation allows God to always forgive and for us to always be reconciled. In other words, our salvation depends on the covenant loyalty of Yahweh, our bridegroom. If Yahweh would divorce us, we would not be saved. And so that is something to ponder today. And so this covenant law of no divorce is a great burden, seemingly, in our relationships. But that yoke is to teach our hearts to soften and to forgive and to love. And that is also to remind us that we are forgiven and pardoned by God. And our very salvation depends on God's covenant fidelity. A lot to ponder here on the mystery of marriage and salvation. May the Lord bless and keep you.
This daily reflection is brought to you thanks to the generous support of the Mission Circle. Join the Mission Circle to help Catholics worldwide understand, live, and share their faith. Sign up at missioncircle.org today.